What's happening? Welcome to Everything Explained with EV. I'm your host, Cory Wong. Today with me, producer, mixing engineer extraordinaire, John Fields, compression user.
True.
Which is why he's here with us, and Electro-Voice's engineer, mastermind, Ethan Wenzel. Today we're talking about compression. I'm just going to start things off. Simple definition of compression, come at me. Automated volume adjustments to control and manage the dynamic range of audio. Simple explanation. We're going to get deeper as the video goes on. There are several aspects to compressors that we see, whether it be on pedals or plugins. John, talk to me a little bit about the things that we see on compressors and what they do.
You got four basic. There's all kinds of additives that they've over the years, but generally speaking, you got threshold, ratio, attack, and release. And the threshold is basically, where do you want this thing to kick in? At what point do you want the compressor to start compressing? The ratio is, how much would you like it to compress? 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 1,000-to-1. You know, generally speaking, people like smaller ratios, and what that is basically compacting the sound by that ratio. So a snare drum that's this loud, bap, can be half as loud if you're 2-to-1 and you smack it hard enough. Attack and release. Attack is when it starts compressing. So do you want it to happen right now at the beginning? Do you want it to be a few milliseconds later or after the thing already happened? That's where you set your attack. The release, same thing, where it's going to stop grabbing. So you're basically going to find that spot, a good sweet spot where you want it to. Sometimes you want it to be fast. Sometimes you want it to be slow. All depends on the source material. That's the general vibe.
Okay. We'll get in deeper into some musical decisions on that. I feel like Ethan's shaking his leg like he's got a couple things to say already.
I probably did it all wrong. So.
No. It's absolutely perfect.
Ethan's here to give us the technical. John's here to give us the musical. Let's go.
No, I love how you rolled through that, John. And I mean, the thing that always gets me when we talk about compressors and dynamics is the compressor is one of those things that's pretty straightforward and pretty simple to explain. You just did an amazing job of it. But for people who are listening to the explanation, kind of getting your head around what all of that means and what exactly does it do, that's this whole other nebulous world, right? Mm-hmm. Taking the theory and the tools and actually putting it into practice. Dynamics and compressors, I think, are one of the more challenging things that engineers and producers can run into out there. And, I think a lot of that sort of comes back to what we've been talking about with the nature of sound and what exactly are we trying to listen to. So we've talked a bit about, how time interacts with audio signals. We've talked a bit about spectral content and how that works with other tools that we have. But the other real fundamental element of sound and audio is amplitude and amplitude over time. And I'll tip my hat as a synth nerd here, so I tend to look at the world in the context of envelopes. Where is my level? How is it moving? Is it going up? Is it going down? How long is it actually taking to get there? And fundamentally, dynamic range is exactly that characteristic. So dynamic range of a signal is basically the difference between the absolute quietest part of the signal and the absolute loudest part of the signal. And the best way I've found to sort of get people to relate to this is back in the day, old folks like us used to watch movies on television, on broadcast, usually late at night, right? And we'd be watching the movie and everything's going along just fine. The dialogue's good. The sound effects are cool. And then we cut to the commercial break and it's like the old Memorex ad where you're just completely blown backwards in space, right? Why did it get so much louder for the commercial break? Well, the answer is it actually didn't. So the movie was mixed in a certain way to have a very broad dynamic range. So the dialogue is down here and the crickets are down there. But then when there's the gunshot or the lightning strike or the car blows up, that's right up at the top to grab your attention and become really significant. The commercial, on the other hand, took that dynamic range, squashed it as much as it possibly could, and moved it all the way to the top end. So everything that you're hearing is as loud as possible all the time, every time. That's fundamentally, I'm not going to make the analogy to modern music there, loudness wars, but similar things happen in music. And ultimately, the tools that we're using to control those dynamics are what achieve that. So you've heard this phenomenon happen before in both music and movies and regular life experience. The other thing that I think is interesting to talk about here is, the tools that we use. You gave a great breakdown of the parameters that are there. We see a lot of these dynamic tools that are out there. The compressor is certainly the classic one, but we also have limiters. We've got gates, we've got expanders, we've got duckers, we've got de-essers. These are all variations on the theme of adjusting my dynamic range to either compress and reduce the dynamic range, or to expand and increase the dynamic range. So an expander is actually going to do basically the opposite of a compressor. I'm going to add more dynamic range at the lower end, so I've got more extension. A gate is simply going to chop everything off once you get below a certain threshold. So all of these tools are really working with kind of the similar theme, similar set of parameters, similar set of tools. They're just doing it at different parts and different spots of that dynamic range, right? So one other thing that I think is also really important to bear in mind when we're talking about this is kind of two important things. First off is going to be correction or technical use of these tools versus enhancement or creative use of these tools, right? So a really great example of where I may need to use correction would be if I'm trying to overcome something like wonky microphone handling, where you've got somebody who is just moving close and away from the microphone, and you hear how that audio is swinging around. Sometimes you have to deal with that. So I can use a compressor to begin to reduce that dynamic range and maybe smooth some of that stuff out.
When you could just have the engineer turn it up when you get away from it, turn it down when you get closer, but that's going to be obnoxious. Compressor makes it so you don't have to manually do that.
Right. And this also gets back into that time constant thing, right? This I think is one of the more challenging thing for a lot of people to get their heads around when they're working with a compressor. What do I set my attack and my release to, and why am I making those choices? So what I've done here is I've put together just a very quick demonstration to sort of talk about how some of these things interrelate with each other, and how things like spectral content and dynamic range interact with what we're trying to hear. So I've got two samples that I've pulled up here, and these look really, really, really similar to each other. We've got basically the same kind of envelope going through the two, but if I expose some of the spectral content, you can see we're actually dealing with two radically, radically different sounds. So if I play the first one, we've got just a very quick, dry hit. You can hear the high frequencies related to the low frequencies, and we can see where that content actually exists. If I move over to my second sample, even though that dynamic range and that amplitude envelope looks the same, because the spectral content is so very different and that energy is summing together in a much, much different way, we hear this completely differently. So understanding what I'm doing with my dynamic range and what I'm doing with gates and compressors and all of my other tools that we have at our disposal can make a big difference on how we perceive and hear some of those sounds. So one of the other things I'd want to do, I've thrown together just a very quick demo here inside of Bitwig. And, in one of our previous videos, we got to listen to saw waves for 20 minutes constantly. I promised Cory I wouldn't do that again, so now we're just going to listen to a drum loop for 20 minutes on end. At least it's a little more dynamic, right? So a couple of things that I want to call out here. On the top part of the screen, what I'm showing is an oscilloscope, and this is just showing the amplitude profile or the envelope of this hit. You can see those are pretty well correlated to each other, and we've got the big rise at the beginning, and then it begins to roll off. Now down here in the lower section of the screen, I want to also show the frequency or the spectral correlation between the two. So this is the acoustic spectrum that we're hearing from the signal. Now, I've got this dialed in to just a 3-to-1 ratio, which again means once I achieve that threshold, for every 3 dB of signal coming in, I'm going to allow 1 dB to come out. So it's just a simple ratio between the two. And now I'm going to slowly begin to bring down the threshold on this so we begin to roll in the effect of the compressor. What I want you to pay attention to as you look at this and hear it is, number one, what happens with my amplitude? Number two, what is happening with my spectral alignment between the two signals? And then the last one, which is absolutely the most important, what do I hear? How do I hear the tonality changing? How do I hear the elements of this hit shifting as I bring this down? So as I begin to roll down the threshold, we can see the compressor is beginning to engage. I'm starting to get some gain reduction here. And we can see that in the top oscilloscope. I'm, of course, reducing that dynamic range pretty dramatically. You can also see that now we've begun to get a little bit of a tonal shift in our signal. I'm beginning to roll off a little bit more of the low end because how the compressor is working. So if I now begin to roll in and increase my time constant for the release, how long does the compressor take to stop doing what it's doing? We begin to get more of that low end coming back in. And as I begin to roll up my attack, what I want you to pay really close attention to is that initial transient, that first hit that's coming off of this kick or off of this snare. Listen to how this is going to change, not only as far as presence and bite, but also the tonality of what we're hearing and what tones of this snare are really becoming to the foreground. So now it's very dominated by the high frequency. But as I begin to increase this attack and let more and more of that signal come through, we're getting more of that low, more of that body of the snare coming through. Okay? So these are the tools that we're using to make these adjustments. And it's really important to understand.
Can you stop the loop?
What?
No. The thing that bothers me is that it's not actually in time. It's driving me nuts that it's not.
Well, see, I did that on purpose because if it becomes the ticking clock, then you know, I know you pull out the guitar, you start jamming like a metronome, and you know, actually that would be a lot more interesting than listening to me ramble on about transfer functions, right? But yeah, so I think you can both see and hear what these tools are doing to the music. And this gets back to the point that we've been making about, number one, understanding what you're listening to and why you're using a tool, as opposed to just looking for the magic setting and throwing that on the entire mix.
Okay,
right?
So John, such a broad question. Why do you use compression? When do you use it?
These days, I'd say it's mostly just control. It makes the loud stuff softer and the soft stuff louder. I mean, so a vocal, I'd say I don't use it on everything, but a lot of the times on a lead vocal, there's a huge dynamic range usually when someone sings soft on the verse, loud on the chorus, and just setting kind of a nominal level will just kind of like reel that in a little bit so you don't have to ride the volume levels as much. There's also a sonic thing that it does, which is what we just kind of witnessed with this snare drum loop, where you can change like the body and the punch of a snare drum, guitars, bass. It's vocal especially. I mean, it's like, I think I probably use compression the most on vocals.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like artistic stuff you can do to like just add a huge amount of punch or even take out punch.
Yeah, things like slotting in transients.
Yeah.
If I'm dealing with a picked bass versus a really
let's say we don't want that pick coming through. We can move the attack much faster attack, and all of a sudden that pick that you thought was all pokey is gone.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's something that you want out of the mix, and sometimes it's not what you want. So that's basically where I'm using it. A lot of the time, the other thing I'd say is just to add power.
Yeah.
And I'd say not level, but just punch and power to drum
I love it when
sets.
compressors make things just feel more in your face.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that phenomenon. Why does that?
I don't know why it does that.
Yeah, no, I mean, fundamentally what you're doing is this is all about, again, amplitude over time. You know, the thing that is, there's kind of two phenomenon that we're talking about here in what you're describing. So the first is getting the transients and getting that attack so everything is clean. And to use an analogy in speech, it's kind of the difference between a consonant versus a vowel. Right? One is a very short transient attack, whereas the other is a more elongated, smoother sound. So emphasizing the transients and making those clean gives you clarity. But the other thing that's really important is establishing what people a lot of times refer to as glue on the mix.
Yeah.
You know, how do I bring everything together so it all kind of sounds like it's operating in the same general dynamic range? It pulls stuff together so you don't have things that are dropping too far below other instruments or something that's jumping way out ahead of something else. It just kind of adds cohesiveness and glue to the entire track when done properly, right? And that, I think, is one of the real struggles that a lot of people have, is learning, how do I listen to these things and how does my ear identify not just what that track is doing in isolation, but almost more importantly, what is it doing in relationship to everything else that's in the mix?
Yeah. Right? I remember, reading, don't have anything change more than 4 dB or 8 dB on your compressor because it's just going to be doing too much. And then I would look over your shoulder and watch you mixing, and you're not looking, you're not looking to see if it's more than 4 dB of change. It's like, I'm using my ears.
Yeah.
How does somebody train their ears to hear the right, quote unquote, right amount of compression? Or
I wish I could tell you the answer to that, other than repetition and doing it, mixing a lot every day and just doing it. Because at some point, not that I was trained by these guys, but I watched a lot of like the super pro mixers as I was coming up as a producer on records that I did not mix myself. And I'd go and I'd work with, say, Chris Lord-Alge or Bob Clearmountain or Mike Shipley. And I just watched how much they would peg the vocal into into an 1176. And I was kind of stunned at the level. It's like, whoa, that's like the most you can do. And, and it didn't sound like that. It sounded like a record.
Yeah.
And I would also watch them like crank the entire 8K all the way to the top, 15 dB on an SSL module on a snare drum. And I'm like, how is that happening right now? And my ears are not tearing off. And it's all about context, really. So, how do you know? By doing it a lot of times, I guess, and just continuing. Maybe there's some learning tools on the internet, but you say some of those are a little rule-based, 4 dB, 6 dB. You got to just kind of experiment yourself, I think.
Well, and one really important thing that I know can lead to a lot of frustration out there in the field for new producers or students or people who are just getting into this, don't start with a produced sample. What I'm using here is actually just a sample that I had in my library. There is clearly EQ and compression on this. You can see it in the waveform.
Yeah.
If you are starting with something that's already been processed, it's as good as it's going to be. You're only going to make it worse most times. So start out with something that you have either recorded yourself or doesn't have any processing on it yet. So you can actually begin to hear what that's doing. In this example, I was just trying to highlight the tonal differences and what actually happens in a really obvious way, not improve it. But that's where you've got to start to make sure that you're getting it. One thing I've heard from a lot of folks is, a good way to know that you've gone too far in compression is if you actually hear it doing its thing, right? If it's just magically getting better, awesome. But once it stops and it's very obvious that the compressor is working, maybe you've gone a little bit too far. Not always, but maybe. A couple other things I'd like to just sort of touch on real quickly when we talk about dynamics are, some of the differences in how we use these tools in live applications versus studio applications versus instrument applications, right? Your example about the compression and how you can just whack that thing in the studio environment, I think is really cool. And one of the unique things about a lot of those studio tools is they have character. So they're doing more than just adjusting dynamics, right? We're getting some saturation, we're getting some color, we're getting character that's coming out of that circuit as we're hitting it harder and harder and harder. And that adds flavor, it adds tonal characteristics, it adds more spectral content, all of which is great for the creative process. But if we sort of switch modes and we are now talking about changing mediums, going from electronic signals to mechanical signals to acoustic signals, in amplifying something and making it come out of a loudspeaker, or trying to use some of these tools in live sound context, we usually don't want any of that. We want something that's as acoustically transparent and clear as we can possibly get because we're trying to achieve a different thing. So a really good example of this is in limiters. If we are doing a mix bus limiter, an SSL is a great example. You can hit that thing and it gets warm and it gets smooth and everything sounds really, really great, but it's changing tonally. When I'm dealing with a professional audio speaker and a PA rig, I need to use limiting now to control my voltage, to protect my transducers, make sure I'm not, launching cones through the front grill of the loudspeaker. And I use that using a limiter. And, that opens up this whole other world of what are we adjusting. So in some of our systems from Electro-Voice, we'll use a specific type of limiter that is very fast. It looks ahead to make sure that there are no transients that can escape before the limiter actually clamps down so we don't, blow something up.
Yeah.
But as we were developing that, we noticed something really interesting was happening. We developed this to be this transparent, very clear anticipation limiter, peak anticipation limiter, to make sure we weren't getting any mechanical overexcursion. And it sounded so much better than what we had been using that the audio engineers who used to hear this fatigue and this crackle and just this tonal change, they weren't hearing it anymore.
Yeah.
So they were pushing the signal harder and harder and harder and harder into limit, and we started to see long-term thermal failures coming in because the woofers were being driven so much harder in limit for so much longer, they began to literally burn up. So we had to implement a completely different type of circuit that actually uses long-term modeling to control and simulate what the temperature of the voice coil is doing over minutes.
Sure.
And we're making just very tiny 1 or 2 dB adjustments over those incredibly long time frames to make it acoustically transparent, but also manage the protection and make sure that the loudspeakers are staying safe. And if you look into some of our modern powered systems that we have now, there's a ton of other things that are going on with limiting and dynamics controls, things that are correcting voltage, things that are adjusting other characteristics of the audio. So understanding how we can use that dynamic range for both creative purposes and technical purposes is really important because ultimately this is going to make your mix and it's going to save your loudspeaker if you're doing it correctly.
Like that. One thing I've seen you do in a lot of your mixes is parallel compression. I didn't really know a lot about it until I was looking over your shoulder, especially in drums. I see you use 2 different buses for the drums that then go into like a final drum bus. And I've seen you also use just blend knobs on things, which actually really opened up my guitar tone, finding out how to compress something really strong and then blend in the natural signal as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about parallel compression, why and when you use it?
Sure. So parallel compression, the blend knob thing, that's a new thing.
Yeah.
Last 10 years. Maybe even sooner. I mean, because it wasn't really in terms of digital audio, it was hard to do that. I'm not sure why that was, but it was hard to be able to do that because of processing power or whatever.
Yeah.
So before that, and the traditional way to parallel compress is to basically let's talk about a drum set. Send your entire drum set to a compressor, a big squashing compressor, say an SSL or something, and then also have it come up on 2 other faders, that are not compressed.
Yeah.
Dry, we like to call that. And literally, if you just mix those two sources together, it's drastic, like what you can do. And, it was hard to do that 25 years ago without a lot of extra expensive gear. Now you can do it really easily. And it adds back to that initial comment about punch, power. Just it kind of brings up all the soft stuff, all the little just in-betweens and just little ghost notes and cymbal touches and twingles and twangles. So, and you can use parallel compression on anything, on bass, on vocals, on guitars, which I know you have now built a blend knob into your compressor pedal. So and that just retains that initial sound. Because sometimes, when we would want to peg that compressor, if you do it too much, you lose all the attack. Yeah. You lose, and so by having parallel compression, bringing back in the dry signal, you don't lose that attack. You're bringing all the initial sound back in, but also getting that punch, juice, glue, what a lot of people call it. And just kind of mixing that to taste.
Yeah. I noticed when I didn't have a blend knob, it just took a lot of the character away from my playing and some of the feel, but it didn't have the same in-your-face punch.
Right.
And because I like the in-your-face punch compressed thing with my guitar tone, but if it takes away the feel and just the character of my voice, I just didn't like it. So now the blend knob, honestly, is just like the greatest thing ever.
It is.
Yeah. Why do you still use two channels rather than just putting a compressor with a blend knob on your?
Because a lot of the times the compressors that I'm using don't have the blend knob.
Oh, okay.
Particularly the tools that I use. Some of them do. One of the ones that I really like does not. Metric Halo panel strip does not have a blend knob.
Got it.
So when you don't have that, you got to do a traditional split.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one other question that's kind of related to this that I get all the time is signal flow. Where do I put the compressor, the dynamics in relationship to the equalizer? And the classic audio answer is coming in here. It depends. Experiment with this, but understand what you're fundamentally trying to achieve. So if I'm putting an equalizer before the compressor, the settings that I'm going to make in the EQ are going to start to influence how the compressor is actually behaving.
Yeah.
Vice versa, if I'm putting my equalizer after the compressor, I'm getting more consistent tonality across the entire mix because now I'm not dealing with a frequency-dependent behavior of those dynamics. So there isn't necessarily a right answer. There are definitely some wrong answers. If I am using a limiter as a brick wall to make sure that absolutely no signal is going to exceed a certain threshold, I don't want to put an EQ that's going to give me 20 dB a boost after the limiter. So that's the only time you really have a hard, fast no. But experiment. Try different sounds, try different signal paths, try different orders, work with parallel compression, work with serial compression, where I've got a really fast one followed by a really slow one. There's all sorts of things that you can do once you understand what is the tool fundamentally doing, but more importantly, what am I trying to do with the sound?
That feels like a good time for you to stop watching YouTube and open up your DAW. Check out these tools for yourself. Train your ears. Comment below, how has compression changed your life? We'll see you next time. Peace.